Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, if depending on when you're actually going to be looking at this. What we're going to look at, what we really have to finish off looking at, we're going to look at the independent sector. I'm going to look at the independent sector in relation to ethical considerations and ethical considerations in relation to complementary and alternative medicine and therapy in general. That'll be the PowerPoint for next week. Um, just a word on the situation that we're in. Obviously, it isn't ideal. I have give everybody the time slot where if you email me, I can give you a call, talk through your work. You can obviously send me work in progress. We're going by the same deadline, which is on the assignment brief. If you can't find the assignment brief, I have sent it to you. It is on Canvas as well. But if you can't find it, let me know and I'll send it to you. Um, and basically, we just carry on as far as we can, really, as normal. But remember, you can, if you email me with any issues, I'll give you a call because I've got a staff mobile. And you can also email me work in progress, but of course you can't email me your final draft because I'm not allowed to look at it. So anyway, today we're going to look at the independent sector. I'm going to go through the definitions of what the sector is and some of the issues related to it which we don't come across when we're talking about the statutory sector, i.e. the NHS. So we're just going into the definitions in a bit more detail. So the whole sector encompasses individuals, employers, organisations, okay, who are involved in all aspects of health and social care, from planning through obviously to delivering. It includes things like care homes, privately run. Some of you are probably working on your placement in a privately run residential home. Private hospitals, obviously, but also charities, the voluntary sector in general. So it's involved in delivering health and social care. As I said, some of you are probably working within the independent sector at the moment, delivering health and social care. We've got charities who are involved in this, commercial organisations as well. They provide, as I said, I think in the previous slide, they provide right from the planning of care right through to all aspects of delivery. There tends to have been a movement in some aspects of health and social care over the last few decades to take more away from the NHS or the state and move it into the independent sector. Surprising statistic, over a quarter of RCN members are in the independent sector as well, which they probably do on, some will do it as well as working for the NHS, but some will work fully, obviously, in the independent sector. They're increasingly active in advising commissioners and the Department of Health and Policy and Strategy, providing support as well. GPs are technically private contractors. Many consultants also work privately. It's very common for hospital consultants to do a certain amount of their hours each week within the independent sector or the private sector. Simple reason, they get paid a hell of a lot of money to do so. And obviously we've got, everybody's talking about COVID-19, the coronavirus. Just 2 days ago, I think it was, the government actually arranged with the independent sector to take over all its capacity. So the private hospitals essentially are given their beds, all their expertise over for use of the state. And they're not doing that for free because they're for-profit organisations. But they've added something like, I think, 8,000 hospital beds to the stock, and I think 500 or maybe 2,000 medical staff as well. And something else I should mention before we actually start getting into this, I'm going to send you I'm going to email you all this PowerPoint, even though it is on Canvas, because there are hyperlinks on it, which obviously aren't going to work on a YouTube presentation, okay? But it is there on Canvas as well. If you want to go through, click on some of the links, get more information, that's probably a good idea. So, independent sector, who are we talking about? Non-statutory organisations, for example, charities, voluntary groups as well, and private organisations such as private hospitals and private care homes. Just a note on terminology for your assignment. By definition, say for example, your local person who offers aromatherapy is in the independent sector. They're not working for the NHS. Okay, so really anybody who isn't working for the NHS or isn't subcontracted to the NHS technically is in the independent sector. But for the assignment, what we're really going to be looking at are the larger organisations, for example, charities, voluntary organisations, and private hospitals, obviously. We're not really going to be as concerned as much with the individual provider, somebody who's offering acupuncture or hypnotherapy or aromatherapy or something like that. Now, I know this sounds like the sort of thing we would do in class, but this is quite a good idea actually. You have to obviously have to come up with a focus for your assignment, which is going to be a long-term condition. But a lot of you have already done that. Take a break now, go and have a look. What private sector provision is there for your condition? Everything from the private hospitals, charities, not-for-profit organisations, the voluntary sector as well. You'll probably be surprised, and hopefully you'll pick a condition which is quite common, quite mainstream. And you'll probably be surprised at the amount of independent provision there is actually out there relating to that specific condition. So, you don't have to, but I would take a few minutes and go and start having a look, because you're going to have to do that for your assignment anyway, to see what independent provision is actually there for the condition, the long-term condition that you choose. This is just one of the links. There's a few in the PowerPoint. You can have a look at them if you want. You probably should know what week we're on in Canvas, and you can go and find this there. But I'll email it to everybody anyway. And if you want to follow up the links, then it's over to you. So we're going to look specifically at private sector. Okay, private sector just being one of the element of the independent sector. First thing to remember, it's about making money. It's a market selling care to people, as it says on the slide, and they cater for all aspects of health and social care, dentistry, screening programs, hospital treatment, GP services as well. What you may find when you're looking at this is some private sector providers are actually linked to the NHS as subcontractors, essentially. That makes it slightly more difficult. You think, well, am I talking about the independent sector here? Am I talking about the NHS? Whenever you hear the private sector mentioned, just assume we're talking about the independent sector. We don't want to get too confused about all that. The idea that, or the reality that this is basically about profit. It's about selling services. It's something to remember for next week. But again, when we look at the ethical considerations in relation to the private sector and the independent sector in general, if they're selling the service to make profit, people have to be able to afford to access that service, and of course, not everybody can. Where then does the funding for the private sector come from? There are numerous sources of that. It may be your own savings. It could be, say, families clubbing together to pay for an operation for a parent or for a child. Private health insurance, BUPA, which is quite common. Direct payments, government or business contracts as well. We're going to look at these in a bit more detail when I bring up the next slide. Okay. Traditionally, the accessing the private healthcare was down to the individual. Most commonly, it would have been insurance, health insurance, and BUPA is the most common one. I assume there are others as well, or people organising one-off payments for a certain type of treatment. Really, since the 1990s, this is more social policy. And we didn't really, I know we did social policy last year, but we didn't really look at this in any detail. There's been continuing or increasing cooperation between the state and between the private sector. So essentially, the state are paying the private sector to deliver services that the state traditionally always delivered themselves. Okay, and this could be for surgery, it could be screening programs, it could be care homes, and I think I've mentioned this before that going back quite a few years now, care homes were essentially most of them were privatized. And then there had to be a raft of legislation actually to deal with that because they weren't actually working particularly well. But just to remember that a lot of even some of the health services you will access yourself is private sector provision. You probably don't even realize that, because the fees are being paid for by the state. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the private sector and the NHS are sort of linked, but it's still technically private sector provision because they are being paid separately by the state to provide their services. However, it says at the bottom of the slide here, the boundary between the private sector and the state or the NHS is becoming less well defined.